After World War II, the Allies didn't destroy Nazi gold. They used it. That gold helped build the financial system we live under today. To understand Operation Safehaven, you have to start before 1946, before the smoke of war had even cleared. Because the system that made Safehaven possible wasn't built in Berlin or Washington during peace. It was built during the war, in the corridors where accountants met spies and diplomats met bankers. It began in 1943. The Allies were already planning victory, and they asked an uncomfortable question. What happens to all the money the Nazis stole? By then, German troops had stripped Europe bare. Gold from the central banks of Austria, Belgium, the Netherlands, Italy, even the teeth of Holocaust victims, had been melted and stamped with Reichsbank eagles. Factories in France and Czechoslovakia had been converted into slave-driven subsidiaries of IG Farben, Krupp, and Siemens. And the profits didn't stay in Berlin. They moved through neutral countries, Switzerland, Portugal, Spain, Sweden, Turkey, and Argentina. The Nazis understood something modern corporations still practice. Money moves faster than morality. Washington saw it happening. In 1943, President Roosevelt approved the creation of the Foreign Funds Control Committee under the U.S. Treasury, led by Henry Morgenthau Jr. Officially, its purpose was to freeze Axis assets abroad and track how German wealth was being hidden. Unofficially, it was the beginning of a massive financial intelligence network, one that merged the skills of the OSS, Office of Strategic Services, the Treasury, and later the Federal Reserve. They called the next stage Safehaven. But even within the Allies, trust was thin. The British wanted to protect their own post-war financial interests, especially the City of London's old relationships with Swiss and Argentine banks. The Americans, newer to the empire game, wanted to replace the British in global finance altogether. So Safehaven, born as a mission of justice, immediately became a battleground between old and new empires. The irony? The same neutral bankers who had financed the Reich were now essential to tracking its money. Swiss bankers became cooperative sources. Swedish industrialists offered technical data. And every new confession was also a negotiation. If they helped the Allies find German gold, maybe their wartime profits would stay untouched. Think about this structure. On the surface, a clean bureaucratic mechanism, memos, cables, diplomatic notes. But beneath, a marketplace. Information was currency, and the commodity for sale was guilt. By 1945, as Allied armies liberated Europe, Safehaven agents followed right behind the soldiers. They weren't looking for soldiers or scientists, they were looking for ledgers. In Frankfurt, the U.S. team seized the Reichsbank's archives. In Austria, they found detailed lists of deposits in Swiss vaults. Each entry was a clue to the hidden empire of capital that the Nazis had built, and that would not die with the Third Reich. But here's the paradox. Every time the Allies discovered Nazi gold abroad, they faced a question. Return it to whom? To the governments in exile that had collapsed? To the Jewish victims whose families had been erased? Or keep it in trust, a phrase that in the language of empires means ours for now, indefinitely. So the mechanism grew. Safehaven turned into a global web of financial surveillance, one that outlived its original mission. It linked the Treasury's files with the OSS, then the CIA. It merged with British and French economic intelligence. And it created something new, the idea that financial information itself was a weapon of war. From that moment on, the U.S. didn't just win with armies, it won with accountants. It built an empire of data, who owned what, where the gold flowed, which corporations could be pressured or spared. Safehaven wasn't about punishing fascism. It was about absorbing its machinery. The factories stayed, the bankers stayed, the patents stayed, only the uniforms changed. And from that continuity came the modern order, American capital on top, German industry rebuilt under supervision, European banks quietly forgiven. That's how systems are born, not with revolutions, but with reorganizations, not by destroying what was evil, but by relabeling it as useful. If this shifted how you see post-war reconstruction, let me know in the comments, because every empire needs a moment when it decides that profit is cleaner than justice, and 1946 was that moment. By 1947, the war had new uniforms and new currencies. The guns were replaced by briefcases, and the front lines ran through conference halls instead of trenches. The illusion was simple. The world was rebuilding. Factories roared back to life, banks reopened, and nations spoke of peace dividends. But beneath that optimism, the machinery of Operation Safehaven kept turning, silently, invisibly, and profitably. Because the truth was this: the Nazi gold didn't just vanish, it was recycled. The looted reserves that once funded conquest were now feeding reconstruction. The same companies that produced Panzer engines and Zyklon B were signing contracts for the Marshall Plan. And the same banks that hid Nazi deposits in 1944 were financing Europe's rebirth in 1948. To the public, it looked like moral triumph. To insiders, it looked like an accounting miracle. Germany's war debts had been erased, but its assets, factories, patents, human capital, were intact. The Allies had destroyed the regime but preserved the economy because they needed it to stop something bigger, the Soviet advance. Look at the numbers. Between 1945 and 1950, American aid to Western Europe totaled around $13 billion, a colossal sum at the time. But much of that money didn't build new infrastructure, it revalued old wealth. The industrial core of the Reich, chemical plants, steelworks, machine tools, was merely reflagged, placed under new management, and plugged into the capitalist order. The illusion of moral cleansing allowed for the continuity of capital. And Switzerland, that neutral watchmaker of the world, became the metronome of the new system. Safehaven agents had pressured Swiss banks to disclose Nazi assets, but few records were ever fully released. Instead, quiet settlements were made, accounts renamed, and gold quietly blended into post-war reserves. The bars melted from Reichsbank vaults in 1944 reappeared stamped with Swiss hallmarks in 1948. Gold doesn't carry ideology, it only carries serial numbers. What emerged from this illusion was a pattern that would define the next century: economic crimes becoming economic foundations, war profits turning into development capital, stolen wealth legitimized by time, paperwork, and necessity. Every empire repeats this pattern. Rome looted Greece, then built its civilization on Greek art and mathematics. Britain plundered India, then financed its global railroads with Indian taxes. The United States, inheriting the 20th century, absorbed the financial skeleton of the Reich and called it globalization. Safehaven had done its job too well. The very act of tracking Nazi wealth taught the U.S. how to control wealth globally. Banking secrecy, offshore accounts, gold swaps, all became tools not just of criminals, but of states. The illusion was that this system ensured peace. In truth, it ensured dependence. Europe's reconstruction bound it to American capital flows and to the dollar's supremacy. The free world was born, free but on a leash, and people believed in it. Workers believed their wages were building democracy. Politicians believed loans were creating freedom. Bankers believed liquidity was stability. No one asked where the seed gold came from or whose suffering it had financed. That's how illusions grow, not by lying, but by forgetting. The ledgers were closed, the vaults sealed, and the archives marked classified. What remained was the story, the beautiful myth of reconstruction, unity, and prosperity. A myth built, quite literally, on blood turned into bullion. If this shattered the clean image of post-war recovery for you, tell me in the comments. Because every time we rebuild without reckoning, we repeat the illusion that systems can be renewed without justice, and that numbers can rise faster than memory fades. Every illusion has an expiry date, even the golden ones. By the early 1950s, cracks began to show in the miracle of post-war reconstruction. And it wasn't a journalist or a whistleblower who exposed the truth. It was arithmetic. Here's the paradox. The Allies had won the war, but they couldn't account for the winnings. Billions in looted Nazi assets had disappeared into the opaque arteries of international finance. Swiss vaults, Liechtenstein foundations, Argentine trade fronts, Spanish gold exchanges. Safehaven's files swelled with evidence, but every lead ended in the same dead end: neutrality. Washington grew frustrated. Morgenthau was gone, replaced by Wall Street pragmatists who didn't want to dig too deep. The Treasury's moral crusade collided head-on with the State Department's geopolitical realism. Revealing too much would embarrass allies. and risk the new order. So the hunt for Nazi gold quietly turned into a ledger of omissions. But mathematics doesn't keep secrets. By 1952, the numbers stopped making sense. Swiss gold reserves had mysteriously increased during the war, yet Switzerland hadn't mined or imported enough legitimate metal to justify it. Where did it come from? The answer was obvious, but politically untouchable. Meanwhile, German corporations, officially denazified, were suddenly thriving again. IG Farben had been broken up on paper, but its fragments, Bayer, BASF, Höchst, were richer than ever. Krupp executives convicted at Nuremberg were quietly released in 1951. Siemens, Deutsche Bank, and Daimler-Benz reemerged as the pillars of the West German miracle. It wasn't resurrection, it was inheritance. And here's the real collapse. It wasn't financial, but moral. The moral claim of the Allied victory, that evil had been destroyed, eroded under the weight of economic convenience. Safehaven's mission had proven that every financial system will eventually choose stability over justice, secrecy over truth, and continuity over accountability. A few investigators tried to resist. U.S. Treasury agent John Paley, who had helped design the original Safehaven plan, warned that Nazi assets were being absorbed into Western institutions. In 1948, he wrote that we have only traced a fraction of what was taken. But his reports vanished into classified archives. The Cold War had begun, and the former enemy was now a potential ally. The files marked Nazi gold were relabeled strategic resources. Look at the logic. In 1946, gold was evidence. By 1950, gold was collateral. By 1955, gold was forgotten. But the system built to trace that gold, the intelligence channels, the bank surveillance, the offshore registries, didn't vanish. They became permanent. They evolved into the financial intelligence architecture we still live under. The IMF, the World Bank, and later, the global anti-money laundering networks. Born not from virtue, but from the failure to reconcile it. That's what it means when mathematics breaks politics. You can hide the facts, but not the balance sheet. And when the ledgers don't align, history demands payment. In trust, in legitimacy, or in truth. By the time the last Safehaven files were quietly declassified decades later, the gold had already circulated through generations of capital. Some of it rests today in central bank vaults, indistinguishable from the rest. Some of it built fortunes, funded industries, even endowed charities. No label says property of the Reich, but the chain of value is unbroken, only renamed. That's how exposure really happens, not as a headline, but as a slow realization. That the system didn't collapse because of corruption, it was sustained by it. And the world moved on, calling it order, calling it peace. If this part made you question what victory really means, leave a comment where you're watching from. Because the fall of Safehaven wasn't the end of a scandal. It was the moment when secrecy became policy, and when the moral balance sheet of the 20th century was quietly written in red. If you're hearing this in 2025, know this. Operation Safehaven never really ended. It just changed its logo. The files were closed, the agents retired, the gold melted and restamped, but the system remained. The same blueprint designed to trace Nazi wealth became the backbone of how the modern world tracks everyone's wealth. What began as a manhunt for looted gold evolved into a global surveillance network for capital itself. Let's trace that lineage. 1946. Safehaven agents combed through Swiss banks to locate secret Nazi deposits. 1970s. The same Swiss banks become the model for offshore havens from the Caribbean to Singapore. 1990s. The U.S. creates the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, FinCEN, inheriting Safehaven's methods. tracing flows, decoding shell companies, following hidden assets. 2020s, the same architecture powers sanctions, anti-money laundering operations, and corporate blacklists. But here's the irony. The watchers became the users. The very governments that once condemned secrecy now weaponize it. When the US freezes a billionaire's assets, or the EU seizes illicit Russian funds, they're performing a modern safe haven. A hunt for hidden wealth justified by morality, but driven by power. The mechanism hasn't changed, only the target has. Look at today's numbers. The OECD estimates that between $7 and $10 trillion sits in offshore accounts, untraceable to any real owner. Those aren't pirates or smugglers. They're states, corporations, and banks, the same entities that built the post-war financial order. The ghost of safe haven lives in every Panama paper, every leak about tax havens. It's not exposure, it's déjà vu. And gold? It's still the silent witness. Central banks are hoarding it again. China, Russia, India. As if remembering an old truth, when empires shift, paper burns, but metal endures. The same game played in Zurich in 1946 is being replayed in Shanghai and Dubai today. Digital currencies, sanctions, asset seizures. These are just the new instruments of the same symphony. Because the deeper lesson of safe haven wasn't about Nazis or banks. It was about control. Who decides which money is clean? Who defines what counts as justice? In 1946, the answer was the victors of war. In 2025, it's the victors of information, those who control data, payment systems, and compliance networks. SWIFT, FATF, the IMF, all descendants of the same genealogy of moralized finance. And here's the paradox. Safe haven taught the West how to trace every hidden transaction, yet it also taught the wealthy how to hide better. Every new layer of transparency creates new shadows. Every new sanction spawns a new route. The world runs on the same double standard that began in the ashes of Berlin. Moral crusade on the surface, quiet profit underneath. When you see a bank find billions for money laundering, remember, the system doesn't want purity, it wants obedience. And when you hear the phrase protecting democracy, ask, whose balance sheet is being protected? That's the modern echo of Operation Safehaven. A world where secrecy is outlawed for the poor and privatized for the rich. If this resonates with you, if you've ever felt that the rules are written differently for different people, write in the comments where you're watching from, because the gold of 1946 is still circulating, just in different forms, under digital masks. The names changed, the logic didn't. The safe haven became the system itself. We like to think that history moves forward, that every war, every investigation, every crisis leaves us wiser. But Operation Safehaven teaches the opposite. It shows that power doesn't erase corruption, it adopts it, and that money, once stolen, never dies. It only changes owners and justifications. Look at the pattern. The gold of 1946 became the credit of 1956, the dollar dominance of 1971, the derivatives of 2008, and the digital reserves of today. Different empires, same principle. Convert chaos into capital, wrap it in law, and call it progress. That is the hidden law of modern history, the alchemy of power through finance. What began as a moral mission to recover Nazi wealth became the moral template for a global order where every atrocity, every collapse, can be monetized. Justice became negotiable, secrecy became an institution, and morality became a budget line. If arithmetic broke politics once, it will do so again. Because the same imbalance still grows, numbers rising faster than real value, paper wealth outpacing human production, speculation replacing substance. When that ratio collapses, as it always does, it will not be nations that fail, but trust itself. The final irony of safe haven is that the hunt for stolen gold taught the world to hide wealth more perfectly than ever before. And in that perfection lies the next crisis. Because systems don't collapse from evil intentions. They collapse when mathematics outgrows myth. When the belief that the system is fair no longer balances the ledger. So remember this. Every operation begins with noble words: recovery, stability, reconstruction. But behind the paperwork and speeches, someone always writes the quiet equation. Who gains, who pays, and who disappears from the books? We are still living inside that equation. The vaults are now digital, the gold invisible, but the arithmetic unchanged. What was once hidden in Zurich is now hidden in algorithms, and the same question remains unanswered. Who guards the guardians of wealth? If this story made you see history not as the past, but as a mirror of the present, leave a comment and share it. Because every generation must rediscover the same truth, that empires fall not when their armies lose, but when their ledgers no longer add up.